At 21:40 on a Tuesday night, my older brother knocked a stack of binders out of my hands in the lobby of a building he did not have the clearance to walk past the second floor of. He did it with his shoulder. That's the part people always get wrong when I tell this. They picture a shove. It wasn't a shove, it was a shoulder dropped 6 inches and turned, the way you'd move through a doorway you were pretending was too narrow. 4 binders, 300 pages of pressure plate signatures, thermal overlays, and a ground-penetrating radar map of a sublevel nobody in that lobby had ever heard of. Paper went everywhere, under the turnstiles, under the boots of his men. I got down on the polished floor in my gray blouse and my government glasses, and I started picking it up, page by page. In order, because the order mattered. And my brother, Captain Marcus Hollis, Troop Commander Alpha, 36 years old and beautiful the way a recruiting poster is beautiful, put his hands on his hips and turned to his team and said, loud enough for the security desk to hear. See this? This is why God made 2 kinds of people. Some of us go into the hole, some of us type up what happened after. He nudged a binder toward me with his toe. Have the coffee ready when we get back, sweetheart. We're going to be tired, 4 of his men laughed. One didn't, remember that one. His name was Reyes, and in 31 hours he was going to be the only reason there was anybody left to argue about. I outranked him. I want that on the table early because it is the first thing people ask me and the last thing they believe. I had been a major for 11 months, he had been a captain for 6 years. There is a version of that lobby where I turn around and end his afternoon with 1 sentence and a phone call to his battalion, and I want you to hold on to the fact that I never did it. Not once in 2 years, my mother never did it either. That is not a coincidence, and it took me 30 years and a hearing room to find out why. I didn't answer my brother, I finished collecting the pages. I stood up. I badged through the turnstile he couldn't badge through. And I rode the elevator down 3 levels to a room with no windows and no clocks, and I sat down at a console, and I put on a headset, and I went to work. 31 hours from that moment, I would be the only voice 5 men in a mountain could hear. On that net, I am not Elena, I am not Major Hollis. I am not anybody's sister on that net, I am Overlord. And 31 hours from the moment he called me sweetheart in that lobby, my brother was going to be sealed alone in the dark under 600 tons of rock, screaming that name into a radio, begging it to save his life. That's not the part that breaks people, though. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because you're going to sit with me for a while, and you deserve to know what you signed up for. The part that breaks people comes 6 weeks later, in a hearing room with bad carpet, when a board of inquiry pulled a magnetic tape from 1995 out of an archive because a computer told them to, and my father stood up in the middle of a federal proceeding and tried to stop them from playing it. My father had one story, he told it 400 times. At Rotary lunches, at veterans' halls, at my brother's graduation, at my mother's funeral. I could recite it in my sleep by the time I was 9. And in 400 tellings over 31 years, he never once mentioned a radio. If you've ever been the person in the room they talk over, the one who knows the answer and gets handed the coffee pot anyway, do me a favor before we go on. Type the word listening in the comments, just that. And tell me where you're listening from and who you served for, if you served. I read them. I read all of them. And subscribe, because what happens in that hearing room is not what you think it is, and I don't want you to miss it. Let me back up. My name is Elena Hollis. I am 30 years old. I am a major in the United States Army, and I have never fired a weapon at another human being in my life. What I do is harder to put on a Christmas card. I run the Joint Effects Cell out of a facility outside Washington that everybody who works there just calls the Annex. 3 sublevels, no windows, air that tastes like pennies and floor wax. When a ground element goes into a structure nobody has mapped, I am the one holding the map. Seismic returns, acoustic arrays, thermal signals, the whole spine of it. I take 12 streams of garbage and turn them into a sentence a man can act on while he's terrified. The sentence is usually 4 words long, it has to be. A man breathing hard at 2 in the morning can hold 4 words. Here's the thing my family never understood, and here's the thing that made all of this possible. Overlord is not a nickname, it isn't a call sign somebody gave me because I was special. Overlord is the name of the desk. Whoever is in that chair on that shift is Overlord. And because the cell is compartmented, Our voices go out through a narrow band relay that strips the pitch out of them and flattens everybody into the same tin, so that if a team is ever taken, nobody on the ground can identify who was talking. So when I tell you that my own brother spent 2 years taking orders from me and never knew, that isn't a movie trick. That's Tuesday. That's the system working exactly the way it was designed. Nobody hid anything from Marcus, the building hid it. The codec hid it, and I let it, which I'll get to, because that part is mine to carry. That night, after the lobby, I came out of the elevator on B3 still holding the binders against my chest, and Chief Warrant Officer Dara Okonjo looked up from her station and did not ask if I was okay. Which is one of about 900 reasons I would take a bullet for that woman. Dara counts things, it's how she thinks. She once told me the human brain is just a bad spreadsheet with feelings. 281, she said. 281 what? Days since your name came off the architecture document. She didn't look up. You built the fusion stack, program office signed it. You want me to keep counting, or do you want to sign the amendment? Not tonight, Chief, not any night, she typed. That's the number, ma'am. That's the whole number. She was right and I didn't want her to be, so I went and stood in the doorway of the archive bay instead, which is where Sergeant Major Efrain Ruiz keeps his kingdom. Ruiz is 68. He retired from the army before I was old enough to drive and came back as a civilian because he could not physically stop. He runs the acoustic library. 30 years of mission audio. Tape and drive both. Cataloged in a system only he fully understands. He hums when he works. Old boleros mostly, 1 bar at a time, and then he forgets he was humming. Long night, Major, Alpha's staging him, he slid a reel into a sleeve. Hollis, that's me, no, he said, just saying the name. He didn't look at me. He set the sleeve down and squared it against the edge of the table, and then he squared it again, which he did not need to do. You want coffee, there's a pot. He changed the subject. He always changed the subject. I have replayed that 30-second conversation more times than I can count, and I want you to hold on to it, because it's already the answer. I just wasn't listening. Now let me tell you about the piece of paper that almost killed 5 men. 17 hours before that lobby and 36 before the assault, we ran the last planning session in a windowless conference room on B2 with a whiteboard nobody had cleaned since March. The objective was a decommissioned mining complex in a highland region I'm not going to name. 3 sublevels cut into rock, 1970s Soviet pattern engineering, taken over 6 years ago by a network that moved weapons and people. Our target was their financier, a middle-aged accountant who had never held a rifle and had gotten more people killed than anyone in that building. I ran the terrain product because the terrain product was mine. I had 11 days of passive collection on that complex. Seismic sensors we'd emplaced disguised as survey stakes. Acoustic returns, 2 thermal passes, and the thing I cared about most, which was a set of ground-penetrating radar returns showing a corridor on sublevel 2 with an anomaly pattern I did not like at all. Corridor, I said, and put the return up on the screen. 41 meters. These returns here, this repeating signature at roughly 1.2 meter intervals, that's not rebar. Rebar doesn't space itself like that, and rebar doesn't sit 8 centimeters under a floor screed. Pressure plate, said Dara. Consistent with a mechanically initiated array, yes, ma'am, I said to the colonel. Non-electronic, which matters, because it means it survives anything we do to the building electrically. Colonel Adaze Bankole runs the Annex. She is a short woman with a very flat voice who has never once in my presence raised it, and who I have watched end an officer's career in about 9 words. Alternative, Corridor B, it's longer, it's ugly, it puts them 30 extra meters from the objective, and it's a stairwell descent instead of a walk. But it's clean, I want the authority to redirect them to B in real time if my returns firm up during the approach. You'll have it, Bankole said. Marcus was at the end of the table. He'd been signed in at the desk upstairs and escorted down, the way anybody gets down there who isn't on the access list. He had flown in for the coordination, and he had his notebook open, and he had not written anything in it. With respect, ma'am, he said, we've got 2 ISR feeds and 110 meters of difference between those routes. Corridor A is the assault plan. Corridor B is a hallway with a choke point and a single point of failure, and if we're in B when the site wakes up, we're in a tube. Your objection is noted, Captain. It's not an objection, ma'am. It's he did a thing with his hand, a small tossing motion, like he was getting rid of something. Look, each back cell is doing great work, truly. But at some point, somebody who's actually standing in the building has to make the call, and it can't be a screen in Virginia. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the seat I was in, and he meant the seat. To explain why I said nothing to that, I have to take you back 3 years to the only day that explains any of this. Fort Benning, October. My brother's graduation from a course my father cared about the way other men care about religion. It was 91 degrees and everybody's dress uniform was a wool prison. There was a folding chair ceremony on a field with brown grass, and afterward there was a reception in a hall with a sheet cake and a coffee urn and 140 people who all wanted to shake my father's hand. Colonel Raymond Hollis, retired, 61 that year. Silver hair, blue blazer, brass buttons, that big warm laugh that fills a room like water fills a boot. Everybody loved him. That's the part I've had the hardest time explaining to people who never met him. He was not a monster, he remembered the names of your kids. He'd drive an hour to sit with a widow. If your truck broke down at midnight, Ray Hollis would come get you, and he would not make you feel small about it. He just could not look at me. Halfway through the reception, he clinked a plastic fork against a coffee cup and got the room quiet, and he brought Marcus up next to him and put a hand on the back of his neck like you'd hold a colt. When I was a young officer, he said, I got separated in a place I'm not going to name, in a tunnel complex that my map said was 200 meters long and turned out to be 900. Radios were down, lights were gone, and I had 4 hours in the dark to decide what kind of soldier I was. 400 times, word for word, and what I decided, he said, is that a real soldier finds his own way out. With his hands, with his head, not with a machine and not with somebody else's voice in his ear telling him where he would go. Applause, it always got applause. Then he took a box out of his blazer pocket and gave my brother the compass. It was our grandfather's. A brass lensatic compass from a war 2 before ours, heavy as a stone, the case worn smooth and gone gold at the corners from being carried. I had held that compass exactly once in my life, when I was 7 and got caught in his study, and he took it out of my hands and said, "Careful, that's not a toy," in a voice that made me sit down on the floor. Marcus opened it, and his face did something I hadn't seen since he was a kid. "Something young, Dad, that's what gets you out," my father said. Not a screen, that. 3 years from that afternoon, my brother would open that compass in the pitch dark, 41 meters from a door, and feel the card spin and never once stop. And then he turned and found me by the punch table, because he was a fair man and fair men remember everybody. "Elena, come here, I came. I want to tell you I came with dignity. I came like a Labrador. I had something in my hand, because I'd been carrying it in my purse for 9 days waiting for the right moment, which is the stupidest sentence I will say in this entire story. A certificate. I had just finished a program at a school I can't fully describe to you, top of the course. A piece of cardstock in a plastic sleeve that meant at 27, I'd been handed the keys to something enormous. I held it out. He looked at it the way you look at a menu in a language you don't read. 2 seconds, maybe 3, that's good, hon. And then he reached into his other pocket, the blazer pocket with the pens in it, and he pulled out a pair of foam earplugs. The orange kind, the kind they give out in a strip of 10 at any range in America, 40 cents a pair, still in the little cellophane. He put them in my hand and folded my fingers over them, warmly, the way you'd give somebody a piece of candy. "Here you go," he said, "for your work. Your job is to sit still and listen." He patted my closed hand twice. "That's a real job too, sweetheart. Somebody's got to hear the traffic." And he laughed. And the people around him laughed. Because it was funny. Because it was Ray. And Ray was funny. My brother was maybe 8 feet away, holding $400 of brass and 110 years of family, and he laughed too. Not cruelly. He laughed the way you laugh when your father makes a joke and you are 33 years old and you still want him to think you're fun. I said thank you. I went out to the parking lot and I sat in a rented Malibu with the air conditioning on high, and I looked at those earplugs in my palm for about 4 minutes. Then I put them in my pocket. I still have them unopened. They lived taped to the underside of my console for 3 years, and I am going to tell you why, and it is not the reason you think. Because there's an older memory underneath that one. There always is. I was 6. We were in the house on Ridgeway with a long hallway that ran from the kitchen to the back bedrooms, and my mother would turn off every light in it and stand at one end and say, "Okay, Lena." Walk to my voice, that was the whole game. Dark hallway. No hands out, no touching the wall. Touching the wall was cheating. She'd say 3 steps, stop, breathe, and I'd take 3 steps and stop and breathe. 3 more, stop, you're doing great, now turn a little toward me, just your shoulders, and 3 more. I'd get to the end and she'd catch me by both arms and swing me around, and I'd be laughing so hard I'd get hiccups. We played that game for years. I thought she'd made it up. I thought it was ours. Her name was Marguerite. Everyone called her Margot. She never changed her name on a uniform. She said the army had her one way and my father had her the other, and she liked keeping the 2 of them in separate boxes. She had been a sergeant, a radio operator, and she got out in '96 and never talked about it, and she made a terrible pot roast and an outstanding pie crust. And she died at a kitchen table in Georgia at 41 years old of an aneurysm nobody saw coming while I was in the 3rd grade. There was no flag, there was no folded triangle, there was no honor guard. She died like a civilian in an ordinary chair, and the only medal in her box was an Army Commendation Medal from 1995, with a citation that ran 4 lines long and used the words administrative support. I read that citation maybe once a year until I was 20. I never thought about it hard, because when you're a kid, your mother's box is just your mother's box. It took me until I was 30 and sitting in a hearing room to understand that 4-line citation was the single most dishonest document I have ever held in my hands. Now put me back in that conference room, with 11 days of collection on the screen behind me, and a brother at the end of the table telling a colonel that a screen in Virginia couldn't smell smoke. I could have said something. Here's my flaw, and I've had 6 weeks with a lawyer and 8 months with a therapist to name it properly, so let me just name it. I believed the work would speak for itself, that's it. That's the whole disease. I believed that if I was careful enough, and correct enough, and quiet enough, the record would eventually stand up on its own 2 legs and speak on my behalf, and I would never have to be the woman in the room who fought for her own name. My mother was quiet. She was quiet and she was correct, and all it ever bought her was 4 lines on a citation and a chair in a kitchen in Georgia, and I had that entire proof sitting in a cardboard box in my closet, and I still believed it. So I said, "Understood, sir," and I sat down, and I let it go. 11 days of collection, and I gave it away in 2 words. I have had 2 years to think about those 2 words. 22 hours later, a memorandum came through. 2 paragraphs, subject line command and control relationships, objective Sparrow. It requested that the reachback element supporting the assault troop be designated advisory only for the duration of the operation, with all routing and maneuver decisions retained by the ground force commander. Advisory only. 2 words. It meant I could still see everything and still say everything, and the ground force commander was under no obligation to do one thing about it. If he ignored me, I had no mechanism, none, to override him. I want to stop for 1 second right here, because some of you know exactly what that piece of paper feels like in your hands. If you were ever the second child, the practical one, the one who got the sensible gift while somebody else got the heirloom, comment 3 words for me. I was never the spare. That's it, 3 words. I want to see how many of us there are, because I promise you the number is going to surprise you. The memorandum was signed by Major General Pike. He approved it in 4 minutes. I know that because the timestamps are in the record, and the record is now, ironically, extremely public. It came into his queue at 14:11 and it went out at 14:15. 4 minutes, to take away the only authority standing between 5 men and a floor full of pressure plates. This is where people expect me to say he was evil. He wasn't. Pike was a busy 2-star with 300 emails and a request from a troop commander whose father he'd served with for 14 years and liked enormously. He read 2 paragraphs. He thought, sure, ground commander's call, and he clicked. That's all, that is the entire mechanism. Nobody in this story ever decided to hurt anybody. They just kept doing small reasonable things fast. That's how it actually happens. That's how it always actually happens. 26 hours from that click, a man was going to be on his knees in the dark, and the only person on earth allowed to help him would be the one that click had silenced. Dara read the memo over my shoulder and made a sound in the back of her throat. "Fight it," she said. "On what grounds, Chief? He's the ground force commander. It's his call to make, on the grounds that in 11 days of collection you have a return you don't like, and now you can't do anything about it. I can advise, you can advise, she said. She dropped it on my desk. Ma'am, respectfully, you have got to stop letting people take the pen out of your hand and then telling yourself it's a rule. 6 hours later, my father called me. I was in my car in the parking garage. I hadn't started the engine. I'd just been sitting there in the dark with my hands on the wheel for probably 10 minutes, which is a thing I did more than I'd like to admit that year. I picked up because I always picked up. There she is, he said. Warm, big, glad to hear from me. He hadn't called in 5 weeks. How's my girl? Working. Well, don't work too hard. They don't pay you extra. He laughed. Then easy as anything. Hey, listen. Your brother tells me they got the command relationships sorted out over there. Everything in my chest went very still. Did he? He mentioned it was a little tangled up. Bunch of layers, so I made a call. Pike and I go way back. He was a captain when I had the battalion. Good man, terrible golfer. Another laugh. I told him, look, Bill, at the end of the day you've got to let the man in the building run the building. He said it the way you'd tell somebody you got them a table at a restaurant. I said, you called a general officer about an operational control relationship. I called a friend about a headache my son was having. Little edge coming in now, the first flick of it. Elena, don't do the voice. What voice? The one where you're right. He sighed, and it was a sigh with genuine tiredness in it. And God help me. Part of me still wanted to fix it. Honey, I know you all do good work down there. I do. But when the shooting starts, a screen can't smell smoke. A screen can't feel the floor. A real soldier finds his own way out in the dark. Not with a machine, and not with somebody's voice in his ear telling him where to put his feet. 401. And here's what I did, because I want this to be an honest account and not a story where I come out looking good. I said, okay, Dad. I said, okay. I said, it's late. I said, I love you. Because I did. That's the whole ugly thing I did. And I hung up, and I sat there, and I thought about my mother in the hallway on Ridgeway saying 3 steps, stop, breathe, and about a man who had spent 31 years telling 400 rooms that no such voice had ever helped anybody. That was the night I broke a 3-year habit. At 0107 hours before the assault, I went back down to B3 and I opened a blank memorandum and I wrote 406 words. It laid out the GPR returns on Corridor A, it laid out the spacing analysis. It stated, in the driest language I could manage, that in my professional assessment the corridor contained a mechanically initiated pressure plate array, that the array would be unaffected by any electronic countermeasure we employed, and that I recommended in the strongest terms that the assault element use Corridor B. And then at the bottom I did the thing I had not done in 3 years. I typed my name, not the desk, not the cell, not reachback element. I typed Hollis, Elena R. Maj, and I attached the memorandum to the mission folder as a formal duty to warn, which is a specific thing with a specific weight, and which cannot be quietly removed. Dara was standing behind me. She had come in on her own time. She read it over my shoulder, and when I hit submit she didn't say anything for a second. Then she said 282. What days, she said. Now it's a different count, I laughed. It came out wrong. I did not know, I could not possibly have known, that I had just written the single most important document of my life. Not because it saved anybody, it didn't. Nobody read it in time. But 6 weeks later, in a room with bad carpet, that memorandum was going to be the reason a board of inquiry believed one word out of my mouth. The assault went at 0200 local. I want to describe the room to you, because people all imagine something with red lights and countdown clocks. It's beige, there are 17 of us, the coffee is bad in a specific institutional way. Somebody's birthday card is going around and you sign it between reports. The wall is 9 screens and none of them look like a movie. They look like weather maps drawn by someone who hates you. I had my headset on. I had the earplugs taped under the lip of the console where I could feel them with my knee, which I know is insane, and which I had done every shift for 3 years. And Alpha went in. For the first 11 hours, nothing went wrong, and nothing going wrong is the most expensive thing in the world to build. That's what good looks like. They cleared sub-level 1 in 90 minutes. They found a generator room, and a dormitory and 13,000 rounds of ammunition, and a whiteboard with a shipping schedule on it that made 3 analysts extremely happy. Sergeant First Class Reyes came up on the net twice with corrections to my structural model, and both times he was right, and I liked him enormously for it. They took the objective at hour 11:22. alive, uninjured, sitting in a chair in a basement office in his socks. Hour 11:22, and 20 miles from me, in a command suite in the Pentagon, a room full of people started shaking hands. My father was in that room. He'd been invited to observe as a distinguished retiree, which happens, and which is normal, and which nobody thought twice about. He had a cup of coffee and a good seat, and his son's name was on the biggest win of that quarter. Somebody clapped him on the shoulder. 21 minutes later, my brother turned off his uplink. Here is exactly what happened, and I can give it to you to the second, because every second of it is in the record now. At 11:41 and 7 seconds into the operation, my seismic array on the eastern slope returned a signature I had been waiting 11 days to see. When you emplace ground sensors around a structure, you're not really listening for footsteps. You're listening for the building. Buildings talk. They settle, they breathe, they respond to load. And what I got at 11:41 was a load response from sublevel 2, 30 meters east of the assault element, that had no business existing, because it meant something under that floor had shifted weight when nothing was standing on it. Somebody in that complex had just armed something. Manually, by hand, I had the corridor product up in 4 seconds. All stations, this is Overlord priority. The room went from birthday card to church. Alpha Overlord, do not enter corridor A. Say again, do not enter corridor A. I am now assessing a live mechanically initiated array under the floor screed, 1.2 meter intervals, 41 meters of it, and I am telling you it just got armed by hand. Route corridor B stairwell descent, break, Alpha, acknowledge. 2 seconds, Overlord Alpha 4 Reyes, flat calm, a man reading a grocery list. Copy corridor A negative, corridor B standby. And then the internal team net, which we monitored, and which my brother had forgotten we monitored, or more likely had never once considered. Belay that, Marcus, breathing hard up, riding the high of a captured objective. 4. We are not walking 110 meters down a stairwell with a package in hand because a screen in Virginia got a hiccup on a seismic. We push A, sir, the cell's got, the cell is advisory, not shouting. Almost cheerful, that's what I can't get out of my head. It was almost cheerful. Read the memo, Reyes, I've got the ground. I've got the call, a pause. Then to somebody standing next to him. Half a laugh in it. Switchboard girl's going to talk us into a tube. 11:43 and 19 seconds he keyed off his satellite uplink. That is not an accident, and it is not a button you brush with your elbow. It is a two-step action with a confirmation. You have to want it. The blue icon on my screen that was Alpha 1 went from solid to hollow. I sat there with my hand over my mouth for 1 full second. Then I said, Colonel, I've lost the ground force commander's uplink. Alpha 4 still has TroopNet, requesting authority to direct Alpha 4 independent of the ground force commander. And Bancoli, and I will never blame her for this, because she was right. And being right is not the same as being able to live with it, Bancoli said. Negative, Major, your advisory, advise, so I advised. I put it on every channel I had. I said it 4 different ways in 90 seconds. Reyes acknowledged every single time in that same flat grocery list voice, and every single time he was talking to a troop commander walking away from him down corridor A with a detainee and 2 men. At 11:47 and 4 seconds the floor let go. I'm not going to dramatize this part. There is nothing here that deserves dramatizing. It was a layered initiation. First, a shaped charge in the ceiling void dropped the fire door at the corridor mouth and cut the element in half. Then an electromagnetic device on the sublevel, crude, wired to the same circuit, killed every piece of electronics inside that rock. Night vision, weapon optics, radios, the tablet in Reyes' chest rig. Then a fuel fire in the generator room 2 floors down, and the air handling in that complex was original 1970s equipment, and it did the only thing it knew how to do, which was keep moving air. My screens didn't go dark, that's the strange part. They went stale, everything froze at 11:47 and just sat there, a dozen perfect feeds of a moment that no longer existed. Sergeant Kessler was 9 meters from the ceiling charge when it went. He is 24 years old, and he will never hear a bird again out of his left ear, and he is not going to deploy anymore. And there is nothing in this story. No hearing, no citation. No correction to any record anywhere. That gives that back to him. I want that sitting in this account where you can see it, because I am not going to tell you a story about justice and let you walk away thinking the ledger balanced. It did not balance. Reyes got the four of them into the stairwell. Corridor B, the one he'd been ready to walk 2 minutes earlier. He did it in the dark by feel with a man who couldn't hear him, and he did it right. Marcus was on the other side of the fire door, alone. Sublevel 2. In a corridor 41 meters long with a live array under the floor, and no light and no radio and smoke coming up through the vents, and the only thing on his body still working was a tourniquet, a knife, and our grandfather's compass. He told me later what he did with it. He told the board, actually. I just happened to be in the room. He opened it. In the pitch black, with his thumb over the glass, he opened a brass lensatic compass in a room lined with steel shoring and magnetized rebar and a fire 2 floors down, and he felt the card spin, and spin, and spin, and not stop. A compass tells you which way is north. It does not tell you which 8 centimeters of floor will kill you. He put it in his cargo pocket. He never got it out again. At 11:52, he found the emergency beacon on his rig, a hardened, shielded, dumb little transmitter that exists for exactly this, that has no electronics worth frying, that does one thing, which is to open a voice channel to the operations cell and nothing else. And it came up in my headset. I have heard a lot of men on bad nights. I have never heard anything like this, and I hope I don't again. Overlord, Overlord, this is Alpha 1, this is. His breathing was wrong. Too fast, too shallow, a man on the edge of the thing that comes after fear. I'm below the door. I'm in a... I can't see. There's no... I can't see, Alpha 1, Overlord, I have you, stop moving. There's smoke coming in, I can't. Overlord, please. Please, get me out. I don't want to. And his voice broke completely. And he said, I don't want to die down here. 31 hours. 31 hours before that voice had told a lobby to have the coffee ready. I sat in a beige room 4,000 miles away with my hands flat on a desk, and I listened to my brother beg the switchboard girl for his life. And I want to be honest with you about the next 4 seconds, because those 4 seconds are the only part of this whole story I am actually ashamed of. For 4 seconds I didn't do anything, not because I wanted him to die. I have never wanted that, and I did not want it then. For 4 seconds I sat there and I thought about a hallway on Ridgeway. I thought about a pair of 40-cent earplugs folded into my hand at a graduation. I thought about my mother's box in my closet and the words administrative support. And some small ugly thing in the basement of me thought, he's going to have to say it. Out loud on a recorded net, he's going to have to admit he needs the machine. 4 seconds, that's how long I was a small person. Then I looked at the board and I did my job. Here was the problem, and it was not a small one. That fire door was a mechanical blast door with an electric release, and every electric thing in that building was dead. There was exactly one way to move it, the site's own hardened backup bus, which we had mapped and which we could reach through a physical bypass, and getting authority to push that bypass. While a ground force was in contact and the ground force commander was non-functional, required a protocol. It's an old protocol, it's been in the books under one name or another, since before I was born. The current name is LAZARUS. What LAZARUS does is simple and brutal. It formally declares that the ground force commander is no longer functional, and it transfers emergency routing authority to the operations cell, to OVERLORD. It hands me the building. And it has a condition attached. Because of course it does. Because the people who wrote it a long time ago understood that if you're going to let a desk take a troop away from its commander, the whole chain of command had better be able to hear every second of it. When you invoke LAZARUS, the system automatically brings the primary command element onto the net. Live. Full audio. Both directions. Ground and cell. Patched straight into whatever senior command suite is monitoring the operation. There is no version of it that is quiet, so on my screen were 2 things. One was a corridor and a man in it, breathing wrong. The other was a dialog box with my name auto-populated in it, Hollis E. Mod, Overlord, and 1 field left blank, and 1 key to press. If I pressed it, I got him out. And in the same instant, my voice went live into a room in the Pentagon, where a lieutenant general and 7 staff officers, and 1 retired colonel in a blue blazer, were still holding coffee cups from a victory they'd toasted 20 minutes ago. Every person my brother had ever wanted to impress would hear him crying. Every person my father had ever told that story to would hear a machine save his son. And I would stop being a desk and become a name, permanently, in a file that would be read by investigators for the rest of my career. I had maybe 40 seconds before the smoke made the math worse. Before I tell you what I pressed, I want a real answer from you, not a nice one. Put yourself in that chair, advisory only. Your authority taken away by a memo his father made a phone call about. 31 hours after he called you sweetheart in front of his men. One key and everything burns, comment save or comment silence. Just the one word. I have thought about it every day since and I am not as sure as I sound. Then stay with me. What came out of that room is not the reveal. The reveal is 6 weeks later and it isn't about me at all. I pressed enter at 11:58 and 41 seconds. I'm told that in the command suite, the first thing that happened was that the speakers came up mid-sentence, the way a car radio does when you turn the key. I'm told the first thing that room in the Pentagon heard was Captain Marcus Hollis, Troop Commander Alpha, sobbing. And I'm told my father set his coffee cup down on the table very carefully, with both hands, like a man who had just realized the floor was not where he'd left it. I didn't know any of that. I had a corridor, Alpha 1, Overlord. Listen to me, the door is coming up. I need you to stay exactly where you are until I tell you. I can't. The smokes, Marcus. That's the moment. Not the door, not the protocol, not anything technical. The moment is that I reached up and I flipped off the narrowband relay, and 31 years of my actual voice was went out over a live net into a room full of general officers and my father, and I said my brother's first name. The channel did something strange. It got very quiet on his end, in a way that has nothing to do with audio. Lena? Yeah, I'm here. I've got the whole building, Marcus. I've had it the whole time. I pulled the corridor product up and dropped the array overlay on it and started counting plate centers. You're going to be fine, but you have to do exactly what I say and you cannot argue with me one single time. Say you understand, nothing for a second. Then very small. From a 36-year-old man. I understand, good, take the compass out of your hand. I already, take it out of your hand and put it in your pocket. Both hands empty. The door came up 18 inches at a time, hydraulic slow. And it did not matter. Because between him and that door were 41 meters of floor, with something under it every 1.2 meters, and he could not see any of it. But I could. I had 11 days of collection. I had a return that gave me a plate map to within about 15 centimeters. And I had the thing my mother gave me in a hallway in Georgia when I was 6 years old and thought it was a game. Marcus, face the wall on your left and put your shoulder against it. Not your hand, your shoulder. Okay, you're going to walk to my voice. Don't put your hands out. Don't feel for the wall with your feet, you'll drag. Pick your feet up and set them down. Can you hear my keyboard? What, my keyboard? Listen, and I typed. Just typed, nothing, garbage. A steady rhythm. About 1 stroke a second. So he'd have something in the dark that wasn't his own heartbeat. That's me. As long as you hear that, I'm right here and I'm looking at you. Okay, 3 steps, stop, breathe. He took 3 steps. Good, stop, breathe. Now shift a little toward me, just your shoulders, and 3 more. 3 more, 31 minutes. That's how long it took to move a man 41 meters. Somewhere around the 15th meter he started saying 3 steps, stop. Breathe out loud along with me. On his own. The way you do when you're past the end of yourself and you need to hear a human being say a true thing on a schedule. At meter 28, the smoke got bad enough that I had him go to one knee and wait 90 seconds while the handler cycled, and he did it without a word. At meter 39, I said, last 3, stop, breathe. Now put your right hand straight out, and Sergeant First Class Tobias Reyes took it. Reyes had come back. Through corridor B, up the stairwell around. In the dark, for a man who had called him a coward's name an hour and a half earlier. He'd been standing at the far door for 9 minutes, listening to a woman count his commander across a minefield. He told the board afterward that he recognized my voice immediately, because he'd been taking corrections from it for 2 years, and that the only thought he had in that moment was, and I am quoting the transcript, ma'am, that's the cell. That's just the cell doing its job, which is the kindest sentence anybody has ever said about me. Then the door came all the way up, and there was light and there were 4 men, and the net filled with the specific ugly noise of people who are going to be okay. And in a command suite that had been dead silent for 31 minutes, Lieutenant General Whit Caro said, to nobody in particular, "Who is that?" And a colonel checked a screen and said, "Sir, that's Overlord. That's Major Hollis." And my father, Still standing. Still holding nothing, said Hollis. Not as a question, he said it the way Ruiz had said it in the archive bay. Like a word he'd been avoiding for 31 years and had finally walked into in the dark. Here's what nobody tells you about being right in the army. Being right gets you investigated. At 1400 the next day I was relieved from the console. Not punished. Suspended pending inquiry. Which is standard. Which is correct. And which felt exactly like being punished. A ground force had taken casualties. A protocol that gets used about twice a decade had been invoked. Somebody was going to sit in a room and explain every one of those decisions under oath, and it was going to be me. General Caro was thorough in a way I came to respect enormously. He did not open an investigation into Captain Hollis. He opened one into the operation, which meant all of it. The memo, the approval, the routing decision, the invocation, and the officer who invoked it. When my counsel told me that, my first reaction was outrage. My second reaction, about a day later, was good, because a finding that only looks at the person you already dislike isn't a finding. It's a verdict wearing a costume. I saw my father once in those 6 weeks. It was in the corridor outside the JOC on the day I turned in my badge for the suspension. He'd come to the building, which he had no reason to be at, and he was standing near the elevators in the blue blazer, with his hands at his sides. He looked older than he had on the phone. That is a stupid thing to say about a man you spoke to 4 days earlier, but it's true, and everybody who has watched a parent's story come apart knows exactly what I mean. Something had gone out of the frame of him, he said. They tell me he's all right. He's all right, they tell me you. He stopped. He tried a second time. They tell me you had the building. I had the building, Dad. And he nodded, and he looked at the floor, and he said, well. That was it. That was the whole conversation. I want to tell you he apologized or wept or reached for me. He said, well, and he got in the elevator, and the doors closed, and I stood in a hallway and understood that I was probably never going to get the sentence I'd been waiting 22 years for. Some of you are waiting on a sentence like that from somebody. I'm not going to tell you to stop waiting. I'm just going to tell you what it's like on the other side of finding out it isn't coming. It's quieter than you think. And it does not kill you. 6 weeks later, the board convened in a room on the second floor with gray carpet and a water pitcher that sweated onto the table. The first day and a half was procedure timestamps. Sensor calibration, whether the seismic return at 1141 supported the assessment I'd made from it. 3 separate technical witnesses said it did, in language so boring I could feel the board losing the will to live. Then Captain Hollis's counsel got up and went after the only real weakness in my account, which was me. He was good. I want to give him that. He was a major from the defense bar with an unbelievably calm delivery, and he did not attack my competence, because attacking my competence was suicide by that point. He attacked my timing. Major Hollis, you filed a duty to warn memorandum at 0100 7 hours prior to execution. Yes, sir, you had held those radar returns for how long? 11 days, and you filed a formal warning 7 hours out. After your authority was restricted, he let that sit. Major, is it fair to say that memorandum was less a warning to the assault force than a document protecting yourself? And the honest answer, the answer I'd been circling with my counsel for 3 weeks, is that it was both, and that people are allowed to be both, and I did not have a clean way to say that out loud in a room with a stenographer. So I said, sir, I filed it because I had stopped believing that being right quietly was going to be enough. He asked me why I had believed that in the first place. I said I'd learned it from my mother. He didn't know what to do with that. He sat down, and then the board president said that sentence that took my whole family apart. Before we continue, the recorder has flagged that the LAZARUS invocation packet includes a mandatory precedent attachment. Counsel, do either of you object to the board reviewing it? Neither of them did, because neither of them knew what it was, and neither did I. Here's the mechanism, and it is not magic. The whole rest of my life turns on a piece of records management housekeeping, written by somebody in the 1980s who was just trying to be careful. When you invoke LAZARUS, the incident record is not complete without precedent. The board has to review how the protocol was used the last time, in comparable circumstances, so they can measure your judgment against something other than their own opinion. The system pulls it automatically. Nobody requests it. Nobody selects it. It's an attachment like a footnote. The protocol had been invoked in a comparable circumstance exactly one time in the archive. 1995, and the archive custodian was asked to come authenticate the media because it was old enough to be on tape, and the archive custodian at that facility is Sergeant Major Efrain Ruiz. I watched him walk up the middle of that room, 68 years old, gray cardigan, reading glasses pushed up on his head. He put a reel in a sleeve down on the table and he squared it against the edge and then he squared it again. The board president asked him to state whether he could authenticate the recording. And Ruiz said, "Yes, sir, I was on that net. I felt the room change temperature." "You were present for the 1995 incident?" "I was a staff sergeant on the extraction element," Ruiz said. "I was 37. He took his glasses off his head and folded them and held them. "Sir, before you play it, I'd like the board to know I've had a copy of this in my building for 9 years, and I never once played it for anybody. That's my choice, and I'll answer for it. It didn't feel like mine to play." "Why is that, Sergeant Major?" And Efrain Ruiz looked across a hearing room, over the heads of 4 field-grade officers, and directly at me, for the first time in the 2 years I had known him. "Because the lady on the tape was Margot," he said. "And her kid works down the hall from me. They played 11 minutes of it. The audio is terrible. It's 1995, it's a tunnel, it's a mechanical recorder in a truck. There's a hiss under everything like rain on a roof. And through it, thin and steady and unbelievably calm, is a 32-year-old radio operator named Sergeant Marguerite Duval, talking a stranded captain out of 900 meters of collapsed tunnel with nothing but a captured schematic. A compass bearing she couldn't trust, and the sound of her own voice. For 4 hours, alone on that net for 4 hours. At minute 6, you hear a man's voice come back, and it is my father's voice, and it is a voice I had never heard before in my life. Not the Rotary lunch voice, not the graduation voice. It was young and it was scraped raw and it said, "I can't see anything. I can't see anything. Tell me where to go." And my mother said, "Okay, face the wall on your left and put your shoulder against it." Not your hand, your shoulder. I want you to understand that I had never heard that tape. Nobody had ever told me any of it. I had a game in a hallway, and a woman who made a bad pot roast, and 4 lines on a citation about administrative support. At minute 8, my mother said, 3 steps, stop. Breathe. And every head in that room turned and looked at me, because 2 days earlier they had listened to 31 minutes of me saying it to her son. They were the same words. Not similar, the same. Because she taught me in a dark hallway on Ridgeway when I was 6, and she taught me with the exact phrasing she'd used in the worst 4 hours of her life. And I used it on a man in a mine complex 31 years later without ever knowing where it came from. That's when my father stood up. He was in the 3rd row. He'd come every day. He stood up in the middle of a federal proceeding, and he said, "That's enough." And his voice cracked in the middle of the word enough, and a legal NCO started toward him. The board president said, "Colonel, sit down or be removed." And Ray Hollis, retired, 64 years old, 401 speeches, put his hand on the back of the chair in front of him and said the only true thing I ever heard him say in public. I couldn't tell it with her in it. That's the whole story. Right there, that's 31 years in 8 words. Not hatred, not some grand contempt for women. He got out of that tunnel because a sergeant on a radio counted his footsteps for 4 hours. And somewhere in the retelling, the first time, probably, in a bar, to men who were buying, he left her out. And it played better, and it kept playing better. He was already married to her when he went into that tunnel. Marcus was 5 years old and asleep in a house in Georgia while his mother talked his father through 900 meters of rock. And she never once corrected the story in public, not one single time, because she was quiet and correct and she thought the record would speak for itself. She died at 41 and the record said administrative support. And then his daughter grew up and put on a headset and started doing her job, with her face and her patience and her voice, and every single day of his life he had to look at the living proof that his story had a hole in it. He didn't push me down because he thought I was small. He pushed me down because I was the only person on Earth who could make him tall by accident. The findings came out 11 days later. Captain Marcus Hollis was relieved for cause. He received a permanent letter of reprimand for disabling command communications during an active operation, and the board's language on that was some of the coldest prose I have ever read about a member of my own family. He was not separated from the army. He is not going to command again. He was reassigned to a rear detachment as a property accountability officer, which means my brother now spends his days signing for equipment and typing up what happened after. Nobody in my family has ever once made a joke about that. There is nothing funny in it. There's just a straight line from a lobby floor to a supply room, and he walked every inch of it himself. Major General Pike received a memorandum of concern regarding the 4-minute approval and retired the following spring. I was cleared. The finding on the invocation was that it was timely and appropriate. There's a sentence in there about the duty to warn memorandum that I keep in my wallet, and it's not flattering and it's not unflattering. It just says the officer's assessment was documented in advance and available to the command. That's all I ever wanted the record to say, that I was on paper. That I existed before the crisis and not just during it. And then there was the other finding, the one nobody was looking for when they walked into that room. The board referred the 1995 citation to the Army Decorations Board on the grounds that the underlying narrative was materially incomplete. It took 14 months. I did not submit anything. I was never asked for anything. It moved through offices full of people who did not know me, on the strength of a tape and a sergeant major's sworn statement, exactly the way it should have moved in 1996. The award was upgraded, the citation was rewritten. Somebody in an office in Virginia, whose name I will never know, sat down and typed 4 sentences about what Sergeant Marguerite Duval did on a radio for 4 hours. And those 4 sentences are now the permanent, official, unalterable account of it in the records of the United States Army. I have a copy. It came in a manila envelope with a barcode on it. I read it in the parking garage, in my car, with the engine off, and I sat there for a very long time. My father did not attend anything after that day in the hearing room. He stopped speaking at veterans' halls, not because anyone banned him. Nobody banned him, that isn't how it works. The invitations just stopped coming, the way they do quietly, in a community where everybody knows everything and nobody says it out loud. He called me once, about 4 months later. I let it go to voicemail and I listened to it twice, and it was 51 seconds long, and he talked about his knee. I didn't call back. I'm still not sure that was right. I'm sure it was necessary, which is not the same thing, and I've stopped needing it to be the same thing. Marcus came to the Annex one time in November to sign for a pallet of shelving. He didn't come find me. I heard about it afterward from Ruiz. He'd gone into the archive bay and asked if he could leave something in the box with the 1995 tape, and Ruiz said that's not really how it works, and Marcus stood there long enough that Ruiz said fine. He put the compass in the box, no note, it's still there. It's cataloged now, because Ruiz catalogs everything, and if you pulled that reel today, you'd find a brass lensatic compass sitting next to 11 minutes of our mother's voice. Which is either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the first honest thing my brother ever did. Most days I think it's both. A few other things, and then I'll let you go. I signed the architecture amendment, 391 days per Dara, who kept counting. My name is on the fusion stack now. It took me about 4 seconds, and I have no idea what I was so afraid of. I took the earplugs out from under the console, 3 years taped to the underside, still in the cellophane. I want to tell you I did something meaningful with them. I threw them in the trash on a Tuesday and then went to a meeting. In their place, I taped up the archive label off my mother's tape, a strip of paper with a number on it. Nobody has ever asked me about it. Kessler is out. He does something with logistics software in Colorado now, and he has a daughter, and he sent me a picture of her at Christmas, and I have never once written back a message I thought was good enough, and I keep trying. And last spring, a brand new second lieutenant on her first shift, watching me put the headset on, asked me what Overlord stands for. I told her the truth. It doesn't stand for anything. It's not a call sign, it's not an honor, it's not a name you earn. It's just the desk. Whoever sits in that chair is Overlord. The person is not the point. The voice on the other end is the point. That's what my father spent 31 years unable to say out loud, and it cost him a marriage he was never honest inside of. A son he loved into the ground, and a daughter he could have had for free. And it's what my mother knew at 32, in a truck, in the rain, with a hiss on the line, talking a frightened man through 900 meters of dark for 4 hours, and then never mentioning it again for the rest of her life. Here's the only thing I'd ask you. somewhere in your life there was a voice that got you across a dark stretch of floor. A teacher, a sergeant, a neighbor, a nurse, a woman on a phone at 2 a.m. Somebody counted your steps for you and then went back to their own life and never told a single soul they'd done it. Say their name in the comments, first name is fine. That's all I want. I want a page of people who were never in anybody's story and should have been. And subscribe if you want the rest of them, because I've got more, and most of them are about people whose names never made it onto the paperwork. 3 steps, stop, breathe. That's not a strategy for revenge. I don't have one of those. I never got a moment where I stood over anybody, and honestly, the day the citation came in the mail I mostly just wanted to go home.